All right, Edie, you ready to do it?
Yeah.
All right, so here we go. Five,
Okay.
4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Edy Nathan. Edy, welcome to the podcast.
Guy, it's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Appreciate that. So, Edy is a certified sex therapist and thought leader specializing in grief, trauma, and sexuality. She works with businesses, universities, and long term care homes to help people understand how these areas filter through their lives and affect everything from creativity to productivity. Working together, she offers creative ways to deal with grief, trauma, and sexuality. In her new book called It's Grief, The Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss, Edy examines the emotional and devastating impact of loss and trauma. The book identifies the intricacies of the dark and unfamiliar effects on the self, also illuminates how the brain holds a complex circuitry of grief. Edy, welcome.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Appreciate that. Just off the top of my head, grief, trauma, and sexuality, just each one of those topics in and of themselves is like so intense and so intricately layered, right? But all together, I'm like, oh my God. But before we get there, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
So I'm originally a Midwest girl. I'm from Chicago, and I am currently in Massachusetts and New
Oh,
York.
cool.
So that's where I'm currently
Okay.
living.
So let's start off here. How did you get into this field?
It started with grief, although it probably started with my own experiences of trauma, but it that got buried. And then I had a major loss in my life of my loved one when I was 27 years old, and it changed the entire trajectory of my life. And I went from thinking I was going to speak in the corporate world on drug abuse to going back to school and learning about grief and how best to talk to people and help people move through their grief. What happens when you start to talk about grief, if it starts with a personal journey, is that if there are prior traumas, oftentimes when one door opens, other doors then consecutively follow. And
Mm-hmm.
I found myself in the mire of looking at traumatic incidents that had occurred over the time of my life, and really began to see how they talk to one another, grief and trauma. And then the sexuality piece, when you're dealing with trauma, most often you're going to have people walk into your private practice and start to talk about abuse and violence and domestic issues and sexual abuse. And then an entire world began to open up to see how everything was starting to fit together like a mosaic.
Okay, so that's the 30,000 foot view. But to the degree that you're willing to share, what were you on? What were you covering? What had been suppressed?
I think there's different types of suppression and repression, and you can know something but not let it come up. So there was a knowing, and I chose not to let it come up until I couldn't avoid it anymore, which is
Mm-hmm.
really what anxiety is. It's like you can push it away until it gets so big that finally it just overwhelms. And the I had experienced at a very young age having been abused by classmates physically, and that kind of sexual abuse was the beginning of weight gain and protection within my body to say no one's
By
ever going to get close.
classmates.
Yeah.
By classmates.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
What age are we talking about here?
9. Yeah,
Okay.
9. And the thing is that when you're working in this field, you must separate out what is mine and what is yours. And what I
Mm-hmm.
realized was that, yes, it happened. And yet, for those girls to have done that to me, they themselves had to have knowledge, which meant that they must have been abused too.
Mm-hmm.
And they were acting out something that had been done to them. And so my forgiveness, which I talk about in my book on grief, it was part of my own journey and what I teach to my peeps, my clients, and whenever I speak on this is to understand, to have a lens that doesn't have to capture me or hold me hostage. Instead, I can actually start to negotiate and navigate with the hostage taker of memory to kind of rethink it and relive and live with it in a different way.
Mm-hmm. And in all truth and honesty, that can be a long journey from when
Well,
something occurred to getting to the point where you're able to have that sentiment. But how? So this went uncovered for a long
oh, a
time.
long time. And even when it was uncovered, I didn't want to believe it. And I thought that I had created it. I
Mm,
thought that I this is what the mind does, because the idea of it, and for anyone who experiences any kind of sexual traumatizing grief experience, you how could this be?
right.
And yet one of the girls in her 30s came to me and said, I'm so sorry.
Oh wow.
And it was at that point, I was 32 years old, guy, when I realized I didn't make this up.
Oh my God. So out of was this like out of the blue? She calls you or texts
Out of the
you?
blue,
Oh
out of
my
the
God.
blue, out of the blue. It was she saw me on Facebook and she reached out and she said, "Can we talk?" And I
Oh
said,
my
"Well, I
God.
happen to be in Chicago." And she said, "Well, I'm still living there. Let's meet."
Wow.
Yeah.
Heavy.
Yeah. And okay, it's heavy, and it showed me as a clinician the possibilities.
Right. So you were a
It's
clinician at the time.
Yeah, I was actually back in school, becoming a clinician, going for a second master's degree in social work. So I was a drama therapist, creative arts therapist, and then realized, oh, you know what, I need more schooling, and just had written a thesis for my first master's on grief and creative techniques in working with grief, because I'd lost my first love. But it was the loss of my first love, it was the loss of Paul, that began really this journey. And
Mm-hmm.
that is where I see that grief, that losses can be gifts. And
Mm-hmm.
what I do carries him and his life, the man I knew, it carries it forward because of this work and because of what he taught me. Yeah.
Prior to that woman reaching out to you, was there ever an understanding or within you that something had happened? And were you coping in what
Yeah,
ways?
I was coping. I don't know how authentic or real I was. I was very guarded. I was 9. By the time I was 13, I was a thin 9-year-old. By the time I was 13, 14, I was easily 180 pounds, because the weight became my defense.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no one's going to touch me if I'm
Right.
this weight. And we all have our defenses, and they come out for everyone in a different way. And that realization has helped me in my practice now. It helped me when I was learning to become a practitioner, for sure. So,
So, so the loss of your loved one, and then this call from this friend. How far apart were they?
so it was 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah, 5 years.
And they're very interesting looking at this. I mean, I'm curious about how they informed the work you do.
Well, she informed me about forgiveness, and he informed me about how grief is a lone process and it doesn't look the same for anyone.
Mm,
And that though it is painful and it doesn't go away, he really, we want to pretend that you get through it. or over it. Okay. There's the great pretend and the pretense of, right, Guy, I'm going to get through this. I'm going to get over it.
Mm-hmm.
And the realization that that was a lie, that
Mm-hmm.
you don't get over it and you don't get through it. That, as my title says, like, it is a dance, it is a partnership. And by partnering with it, instead of refuting its presence, has enabled me to be sane and more grounded and actually be a thinner person as well. However, meeting up with that woman, that then woman at 32, it was after meeting her that the rest of my weight fell. And so it was very interesting because I, because up until then, I wasn't sure that it actually had happened. And
Mm-hmm.
then, of course, there's therapy and there's conversations and there's intensives that as a clinician and as the woman in this body, I needed to enter into, and realizing that not just talk therapy was going to work, that there needed to be more creative, expressive means like mask making, like psychodrama, like role play, because our psyches love to protect us, Guy. And
Mm-hmm.
so what my clients would find is, I'd be sitting on the floor with them with clay, and we'd be making masks of grief, and we'd break them down. I would have intensives with men and women and grief cruises where people would really work their grief and work through their trauma. When I say through it, like to get to a place where they could partner with it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an awakening. And the awakening comes through, I believe, the creative techniques, not just us sitting in a room talking.
Mm-hmm. Your interest in creativity and creative expression and the dancing with grief, did that come as a result of your loss of a loved one?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there
When
were no
that,
words.
how did you approach that initially and then get to a point where you were like, okay, I want to explore this. I want to help others move through dance, as you say.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it didn't start out as a dance, that's for sure, Guy. It started out with me being very proactive. I'm going to go to some grief groups. I'm going to help myself. I'm going to talk about this. Most of the grief groups, the men and women who were in them were older, 60s, 70s, 80s, and they saw me at 27 and they said, "Oh, you're young and you'll find another person and you'll be fine." And that didn't help. And I refuted that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was crushing because I had hoped that I would get some help and I would find some relevance in what I was experiencing, and I couldn't. And it was then that I said, okay, you're going to have to be a teacher. You're going to have to teach yourself. And as I learned about grief, and I went to intensives with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and did a whole slew of personal work. I realized we need a languaging that's a little bit different than the languaging um, for the dying, and a little bit different languaging for um, anyone at any age
Mm-hmm.
who is facing grief. And then my idea of grief expanded, and it's like, oh, this is not just about the loss of a loved one, Guy. This is about the losses we have in our lives, and
Mm-hmm.
they accumulate. So it was a reckoning with this huge life lesson of grief from the loss of a loved one, grief that happens when there's a loss of the self, and grief that happens when there's trauma involved.
Well, I think each and every one of those could be a podcast episode unto itself and a book unto itself, certainly. But you said you went in and you were doing a lot of work and you were trying to find a different language. What is it that you discovered briefly? I mean, I think just your use of the word dance and as opposed to we're going to get through this is in and of itself a shift. But culturally speaking, how are we looking? How do we look at loss and grief, and what are you bringing to the table, in a sense, your perspective?
How we look at grief and loss is we'll do anything to avoid talking about it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's it.
Right.
And like any good anxiety, when anxiety comes up, what do we want to do but push it away? And, when you push it away, it gets bigger. And so if we think about it, it's an invitation in rather than a kick out the door. And so it is inviting grief in. It is making time to grapple with it, to understand that it can hold you hostage, to understand that it has a grip, and that it will lighten its grip if you start to pay attention. And that is a different lens.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I moved away from the idea of the stages of grief because I found them self-limiting. And instead, because grief is nonlinear, not my term, it just is.
Mm-hmm.
And the nonlinearity of grief, it to me, it's the stages don't speak to, oh, they're going to combine, they're going to coalesce, they're going to create a mosaic, they're going to stack, and
Right.
they're going to be crazy making. And the languaging in that way, I decided to bring that in, and
Mm-hmm.
that's what part of my offering, if you will.
Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, we're not just talking about the grief of loss, losing someone, but as you
No.
mentioned, grief of losing oneself. And
That's
just
right.
to briefly interject what's going on, I recently went through a divorce, which was like out of the blue. And I'm identifying a lot with what you're saying in terms of the grief of losing an identity, you know,
Yes.
and
Yes.
this idea of not wanting to talk about it. I mean, it just seems like such an easy question, but curious about your response. Why don't we want to talk about it? I don't want to talk about.
It might seem obvious, and yet it's what we've done historically, sociologically, if you will, to clean up the messiness of death, of any kind of deathing, like a divorce, where it is you're both alive, but there's a deathing that's going on within the soul,
Mm,
and to just puritanically make things look better than they are. Have that smile on your face, create that Jungian mask, forget the shadows that are in the hero's cave, and
mhm,
and just act like everything is okay, and then it will be. And it's kind of a Pollyanna-ish view, if you will, on one hand, and yet it's self-preservation on the other.
mhm,
It's also there's something important here, which is if we thought about our own demise or our own dying all of the time, I think we would be insane. Okay.
right.
So we must have a healthy denial of death. There's got to be that. To have a healthy denial of death, they're also in line with that is that healthy denial of grief, because to deny grief is part of denying
Mhm,
death. And so to say, okay, I can have that healthy denial of death. I don't need to necessarily have the healthy denial of grief, because one does not necessarily have to align with the other.
yeah, and I think the word your word dance comes perfectly in here. It's it's hard to look at ourselves on the best of day at the best of days. It's really
Yeah,
hard to look inward when we don't know what the hell's going on, when
that's right.
we've experienced trauma and grief. Um, how did you get to the point, Edie, where you were like, this is what I want to do? I want to write books. I want to work with people. How did that come about for you?
Never in a million years did I think I would ever wanted to write a book, you know. And it took me 10 years to write the first book, It's Grief. Uh, but when you think about your audience and you think about the reader and you think about the people who I've been able to help one-on-one or with groups or when I do some public speaking, it's like, okay, I'm going to write a book that when I was grieving would have helped me. And that's why I wrote the book.
Mm-hmm.
And there are parts of it, the 11 phases of grief, the me, myself, and I. There are a lot of wonderful grief books out there. They tell you what to do. They give you exercises, all things that I will incorporate in I do incorporate in my book. The difference is that grief is also one of our best teachers. And it can teach us about ourselves in ways that we never imagined. We don't want it, but
Mm-hmm.
if we allow it. So within the book, I do self-assessments. Are you introvert, extrovert, ambivert? Because based on that, the kind of help you might get is going to be different. What will work for
Mm-hmm.
the ambivert might not work for the introvert or the extrovert. And so to understand, that there's that it's not formulaic in terms of how one gets help, but knowing the self, and grief can provide that if one dares. And it
Mm-hmm.
is a dare to dance kind of piece. It's saying, am I going to be able to create community to support myself? Am I going to be able to talk about this? Am I an introvert? And can I really just, I need to be like with one therapist and one person and that's it? Or am I more of, an extrovert and more mutable in my personality? And therefore, I might go to a group and a therapist, and then I have my community. So the idea that there are so many different uh, vessels that one
Mm-hmm.
can explore as they encounter what they never wanted to encounter, grief.
One of the things I found that when I when this happened for me, and I was kind of open about it, and people were coming out of the woodwork saying, "You're going to be fine. You're going to get through it. It was the best thing that happened to me." Meanwhile, I'm thinking to myself, "Okay, but I'm not even there yet. I can't even think about that thing." You know, uh, I'm kind of really resonating with what you're saying about the grief being non-linear. There aren't set stages. It's going to be different for everybody, and I think that takes a certain amount of awareness to realize for people when they uh, not only go through that, but are talking to someone who is going through that.
Absolutely. Like, I have I call them phases because I see them as just, it's a phase and then it can come back and it's, and they meet again and again and they overlap. And the first phase is called the emotional armor phase, and that's exactly what it is. And your divorce, you were in emotional armor. You might have been numb. You might have gone through high emotionality at times. You might have felt like this is not happening to me. I'm not, and expletive, 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 and yet, it's it's that first phase is, I believe, the place that people go back to time and time again to collect themselves. And that emotional
Mm,
armor, just like my weight was my emotional armor, is the safe haven. So I might go to food and that comforts me, and you will go to whatever you go to. For people to come up to us and say it's going to be better, and it's the best thing that ever happened, they're not meeting you where you are. And
mhm.
what I love to share with people is, you have a voice, and if grief doesn't teach you anything, it is your voice to say, that doesn't help me. I know you're trying to help me.
Right.
What would help me is just to say, what do you need? I'm
And what,
giving that as an example.
yeah, and it's a great one. What did you need when you were going through that?
I needed people to stop saying you're young and you're going to find somebody else. And it took me a good year and a half to finally be able to say, stop saying that to me.
Right. That, I mean, that in it is kind of insensitive, right? It's automatically, I'm just going to discount this person who I just lost and I'm going to find someone.
Mhm.
No.
Yeah, no. And it's also that the other piece, I don't use the word closure in my book. And closure and acceptance are not part of my verbiage, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Because when people said, you'll get to the acceptance stage, that's what they
Mm-hmm.
said. And I'm like, I don't want to accept this.
Mm-hmm.
No, that doesn't feel good to me at all. It feels really crappy because if I accept it, it means it's over.
Mm-hmm.
I I need to find a way to integrate it. And that's when I started to think about, well, what do we integrate and what is integration? And it's a
Mm-hmm.
dance because you know what? That first love, he's in me. He taught me about what love was. He taught me that I could love myself, and then he died. But he's in my heart. He's in my
Mm-hmm.
soul. And I still carry his Timex watch that keeps on clicking. And it's how many years? And it's not because I haven't found other people to love. It's just that we can have our memories, and it doesn't mean that we can't also have our joy.
To what degree, let me just remind everyone that I'm speaking with Edy Nathan. The book is called It's Grief, The Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss. And you also have a new book coming out, which we'll get to. But to what degree is what you're talking about here universal? Or and is there a cultural, there's got to be some kind of cultural component too.
There certainly are cultural components, and though the book itself does not cover, all of the culture resonances
Sure.
with grief, because that would be volumes, right?
Yeah.
What I do bring in is a Jungian perspective, and that Jungian perspective is that of the collective unconscious, that we have these archetypes, and the archetypes are images and symbols that we all, no matter where we're from, no matter what our socioeconomic backgrounds are, no matter what our beliefs, we all know when we say mother, that we know what that means, or
Mm-hmm.
father,
Mm-hmm.
or magician, or trickster.
Mm-hmm.
And so I use that terminology to gather the collective unconscious. We all face grief. How dying is dealt with culturally, even in the United States, is vastly different, depending on one's background. Now
Mm-hmm.
you take it out to the world at large, and yet collectively we know what it is to mourn. We
Mm-hmm.
know what it is to lose a sense of self. We know what it is to be a victim of war, or to be hurt, whether it's teased or to lose a friend. We understand, and that is global. And
Mm-hmm.
does the dress is the book more of a global um conversation about grief? Yes.
You seem to have this innate uh, knowing and an innate passion about this work that you're doing. You can feel it. I can feel it. I'm wondering uh, if you would agree with that.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you feel, Edie, your mission is, your purpose is in the work you're doing?
It's I didn't choose it, it chose me. And it's like a leaving of a legacy, to allow people to realize that taking on the self in the name of perhaps how they face grief, or how grief comes in uninvited, um, doesn't have to land with um, a loss of the self that is so extreme that life is not worth living. And I guess I want to give people a sense of what I call the yet, which is,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, hope. And whenever anybody says yet, then it means I'm not there yet, but there's a hope and a vision for a better or a different outcome or tomorrow.
The new book is called.
So it's a working title because I'm waiting for a publisher to pick it up. But right now it's called Healing Sexual Grief, Reclaiming the Self from Loathing to Liberation to Love.
Okay. We didn't even get into the whole sexuality part, which is a huge component here.
Yeah.
If we could just, well, okay. The book, give us a thumbnail on the book.
Okay. So sexual grief is a new term coined by me after working with trauma and sexuality and grief and realizing my people who were working with trauma, that there was a missing link. And we were talking a lot about trauma, but not really bringing grief into the conversation. And I was, oh, wow, grief and the intensity of grief here is the missing link. And then I started to look at it and realize that right now my working definition of sexual grief is that it is a natural response to an unnatural, sexually traumatic event or experience that holds you hostage and keeps you from living the life you deserve. Mm. And it's not just about sexual abuse or sexual violence. It can occur for anyone along their developmental timeline, from the unwanted child with cognitive issues, and just the very fact that they're unwanted can cause them to have cognitive issues and low self-esteem, and that self-loathing and disgust, that then intimacy or partnering or friendships or work become impossible. That's sexual grief. Mm-hmm. Or the girl who's never told about the fact that she's going to have her menses, and when she gets them, she thinks she's bleeding to death. And because the trauma of that is so extreme, every month her body starts to react and she shuts down. That's sexual grief. Or the women and men who are aging and they're having sexual issues, and they're not who they used to be, and their bodies are shifting, not because of anything that was done to them, but because, again, of something that naturally happens. Mm-hmm. That's sexual grief.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it when you're saying it like that, I'm thinking to myself, of course. I mean, grief and trauma seem to go hand in hand, and yet there aren't always spoken of.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's the missing link. I believe it's the missing link. And if I may share with you, Guy, the most exciting part of the book are what I offer to the reader is learning how to become a hostage negotiator, because I have hostage negotiation techniques in the book so they can negotiate with sexual grief, the hostage taker, and they can be the negotiator for themselves.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very intense. Well, look, Edy, I've got to have you back.
I would love to be back.
You are amazing. My God. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
So my website, which is edynathan.com, and I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on all the social media. I'm on Psychology Today, Medium, Substack soon. So and if they go to my website, edynathan.com, and they write to me, they give me a little note and say, hey, I heard you on Guy's show, and would love to hear more information. They will get a free download of either a meditation or one chapter from It's Grief.
Awesome. Wow. Okay. Once again, the book is called It's Grief, The Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss. Obviously, we could have talked on and on about many things, but look, I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing yourself and sharing your story. I mean, that's what this podcast is all about, and love to have you back, Edy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
You too.